Well, good morning. It is fantastic to be with you. We are streaming to a whole bunch of our sites this morning and also to our online community. And so wherever you are in the northeast of Scotland or somewhere else in the world, it is really, really brilliant to be with you. This is the moment where you might need a Bible, and so if you've got a Bible with you, you might want to turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and that's just a little bit of warning. Some years ago, my wife went away for the weekend. I can't remember exactly why she went away. Maybe it was some kind of a women's conference or something like that. And while she was away, I was holding the fort, and I don't mind telling you, I did quite well. We only went to McDonald's once, which I consider to be a personal triumph. And so one day we sat around, maybe Saturday afternoon, sat around having lunch together, and I'd made everyone sandwiches, and our kids were quite small, and my daughter starts chewing into her sandwich. And you know when people they chew really, really fast and then they slow down, it's like, oh my goodness, what am I tasting? Well, exactly that thing happened. And she went, Daddy, this sandwich doesn't taste quite right. And I was like, oh no, it's fine, it's just because you've drunk some orange juice or something like that. She was like, no, Dad, and the bread is really dry. I said, oh no, it's no problem with the bread, we bought it last weekend, I'm sure it'll be fine. And then she screams, and the sandwich, which was basically like normal bread on one side, when she turned it over, it was bottle green. It was like really, really moldy. And she was horrified, and I'm kind of calming her down. And then she asked this question. She said, but Dad, how did that happen? And I was thinking, well, I want her to be heard in this moment. I want to make sure that I'm giving her a really clear explanation. And so I started to say, well, in our house, we don't look after bread very well. We often leave it unwrapped. And so for that reason, sometimes the bread goes a bit dry around the edges. And then if you leave it a bit longer, it kind of goes a bit hard. And if you leave it a bit longer than that, it goes really stale. And then if you leave it a bit longer than that, it goes bad, which is what you've experienced. And she had this mischievous grin on her face. She said, no, Dad, that wasn't the question I was asking. The question I was asking was, whose fault is it? Anyway, my point is, let's never allow what we're doing right now to become stale. You know, brothers and sisters in Christ, worshipping together, walking alongside one another, being family, building community together, reaching out to our region. Let's never allow that to become stale. Let's never allow our church to become the kind of church where you kind of have to look back to find good times. You know, where you start thinking, oh, remember those good old days. We want the good old days to be right now, and to be able to celebrate all of the beautiful things that God is doing right now in our midst. For our church to be a church that is full of wonder, full of awe, full of celebration, and full of joy. That's the kind of church that we are pursuing, isn't it? That's the kind of church that we want to be, one that is beautifully alive and never dry or stale or hard or even bad. We don't want to be that kind of church. And we've been going through a series in 1 Thessalonians called Future Focus. We've been in that for several weeks now. And one of the things that I think we've all noticed is that Paul is writing a letter to a beautiful church. It's a healthy church. It's in stark contrast actually to the kinds of letters he writes to other Christian communities at the same time, which often he's writing to correct some kind of dysfunction, or he's writing to address some kind of bad behavior. This is not that kind of letter. He's writing to say, you are doing really well, you're super healthy, and I'm really, really pleased with how things are going. And so the question that we're going to look at this morning in our passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is why? What is it that makes this church so healthy? And it seems to me that we would do really well to watch out for what he's affirming, what he's saying is really good, to try to emulate that, and also listen to what instruction he's giving to the church. And so we're going to go into this passage asking those questions. Why is this church so healthy, and how could we be like them? So 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we're going to read from verse 9. It says this: Now about your love for one another, we don't need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. And that's the 3 verses that we're going to focus on this morning. So as we have this question in our minds, like what is it that's making this church so healthy and fruitful, we're going to go through this passage together noticing 3 things. We're going to notice what is Paul doing? That's the first thing. Secondly, we're going to look at what is he commending? And thirdly, what is he teaching? What is he doing? What is he commending? And what is he teaching? So first of all, what is Paul doing? Let's just watch Paul's posture. Let's look at what it is that he's pursuing. I love the posture of his heart in this passage. He's leaning towards his friends and he's just wanting to encourage them. He's bragging on them. He's bringing huge amounts of commendation. He's affirming them. Verse 9, now about your love for one another, we don't need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. He's saying the way that you guys love one another is so brilliant. In fact, it's so brilliant that it seems like God himself has taught you to do it. It's epic. It's stunning the way that you love one another. I was reading, as you do, I was just on the internet one day and I came across this list of complaints that had been brought to a housing association maintenance department, and some of them are really bizarre. So the first one was this: my toilet seat is cracked. Where do I stand? I love that. I mostly love living here, but it's the dog mess outside my door that I find hard to swallow. Another one. This is to let you know that our toilet seat is broken and we can't get BBC Two. Another one. The toilet is blocked and we can't bathe the children until it's cleared. And finally, my favourite one. Will you please send someone to mend the garden path? My wife tripped on it and fell yesterday and now she's pregnant. I love that. The point is, we live in a society that finds complaining really easy. You know, it's like our whole society now is training us to complain. Whenever you buy anything now, you get an email straight afterwards saying, you know, would you give this product a review? Would you give the services a review? And it's like, let me show you how to complain. Our whole society is training us to complain. It's actually really easy, isn't it, to notice what isn't working. And as Christians, often it's easy to notice what isn't working, but also what God doesn't seem to be doing. And so it's easy to be in a posture of complaint. And yet Paul isn't doing that at all. He's doing the precise opposite of that. He's saying, I'm going to notice what is working and I'm going to notice what God is doing. You are loving one another so beautifully, and God has been training you and teaching you how to do it. You know, he's saying the way that you guys love one another, it's amazing. And it's a work of God. And then he says, verse 10, you should do that more and more. Like what God's doing amongst you is so beautiful, and the way that you respond to that, you should just keep doing it over and over and over again. And it seems to me that complaining comes really naturally to many of us, but commending people has way more power. And that really is my testimony. I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing without people along the way who have restored me and built me up and encouraged me at some of my toughest moments. I remember just after I became a Christian, I had this sense of call towards being in Christian leadership, and so I went to my pastor, and he was encouraging, and he took me to one side and he set me this great long list of books to read, and then he set me this great long list of tasks. You know, I want you to go and serve in the kids ministry for a bit. I want you to go and help with setting up the PA. I want you to go and help in this ministry and that ministry. And so it was like this training program that he'd prescribed for me. And at the same time as doing that, I was working full-time in a busy job in the middle of London, working for a software company, and it was hard work. And so trying to juggle these two things was a wrestle, but I worked really hard. Often, you know, I'd commute on the train an hour each way, and I'd be trying to wrestle with these complex theology books and these church history books. and then I'd get home and I'd just wolf a meal down, and then I'd be out serving in different areas of the church. It was really hard, but I really did my best. And then eventually the elders of this particular Baptist church, they said, hey, why don't you come to the elders meeting and share about where you're up to, and let's look at what your next step is. And so there I was, and they asked me, how's it all going? And I said, well, to be honest with you, it's been really, really hard. Like, you know, I've been working a full-time job, but I've read all of these books and I've served in all of these ministries and I've really done my best. And then they turned to the pastor and they said, and what kind of a report would you give on Chuck? And he said, I don't see any of that. He said, to be honest, I'm not sure that Chuck's read any of the books that he said he's read, and I'm not sure he's really served in the areas that he's saying he's serving in, and I really don't think he's ready for anything. I don't mind telling you, that was one of the most painful moments of my life, and it's so confusing as a young man. And what I recognise now was that there was a whole load of stuff going on in his life, and I was kind of caught in the crossfire a wee bit in that leadership structure. But it was painful, and actually there was probably some truth and so on, but it was a really difficult time. Justin and Alison Thomas, my friends, walked with me every day subsequent to that, and every day they encouraged me. They spoke into my life. They said, Chuck, you're knocked down, but you're not knocked out. You know, we see God's hand on your life. We can see how God is shaping your heart. We can see what God is up to, and we know what he's calling you to. And every day, with that encouragement, with that commendation, with that affirmation, they were rebuilding my soul brick by brick. So, this is not just a theory to me. This is personal. The power of commendation, of affirmation, of encouragement is extraordinary. Do you know, it's so easy to find fault. It's so easy to find things to complain about. It's even easier to find someone to share those complaints with. But if we as a church community want to be all that God is calling us to be, then we have to embrace and unleash the power of affirmation, of encouragement, of commendation. We have to copy Paul in the way that he does it. My experience is that our church is a remarkably encouraging community. You know, I see it all the time. I see some young girl or young guy steps up to play the drums for the first time, and suddenly they literally, the service finishes and there's like a tidal wave of people just heading towards them to encourage them. I see it happening when someone gets a new job, or when they run a half marathon that they didn't think they could run, or they start to serve in the kids ministry. You see, there are some people in the church, they're like stalkers. They have the gift of encouragement and they're not afraid to use it, and they just follow people around, just showering encouragement and affirmation on them, and therefore those people become more than they would be without it. And so as Paul says in verse 10, he says, we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do it more and more. And I would just say exactly the same thing to you, especially if that is your gift, the gift of encouragement. Do it more and more. But for all of us, let's embrace the call to do it more and more. So what is Paul doing? He's unleashing the power of encouragement. And in doing that, he's setting an example for us, casting a vision for us as a church community. That's the first thing he's doing. The second thing he's doing is what is Paul commending? So that was what he was doing. This is now what he's commending. He's calling out in them. He's recognizing for them their brotherly love, their love for one another. In fact, the Greek word is completely brilliant. It's the Greek word Philadelphia, which, you know, you're never going to forget that now. Brotherly love is Philadelphia. He says, you guys love each other really brilliantly. He's been eagerly awaiting a report back from Thessalonica. You know, he had to leave Thessalonica. If you read the book of Acts, he had to leave Thessalonica really suddenly and quickly, and he leaves behind this fledgling church, and he's desperately worried about how they've got on in his absence. He finally sends Timothy to go there. Timothy comes back with a good report, and the report is this: the Holy Spirit has built these brand new disciples into a family where they are full of Philadelphia. They're full of brotherly love. As I've often said, I was in the Scouts when I was a young boy. It wasn't anything fancy like the Air Scouts or the Sea Scouts or whatever. It was just the like solid ground Scouts, and occasionally we'd do extraordinary things. I remember one time we all went paragliding for the day, and I was, as you can imagine, really deeply disappointed when the wind became too strong, and unfortunately I wasn't able to have a go at paragliding, which is a real disappointment to me, not at all. But I remember this one weekend when it was like a water sports weekend, and so we did canoeing, which should really be called swimming, and then we did rowing, which should really be called swimming, and then we did rafting, which should really be called swimming, and then we did sailing, which again should really be called swimming. And so I remember they arranged us into little groups on the shore and just beside the river, and they said, okay, now get into your boats, and so my friend David and I, we got into a boat, and David is the kind of guy who he's just done everything before. You know, he doesn't need instructing, anything like that. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so David just pushes off from the shore, and off we go, and he starts pulling the ropes, and the sails start coming up, and away we are just sailing around the River Thames. It was all brilliant until there was this huge pleasure boat that was heading towards Hampton Court Palace, sails on past, and suddenly we're immediately flipped over and in the water, and we're swimming. And so David rights the boat, and we all get back in again. And then there's this party boat comes past. It's like a nightclub on the river. And again, we're just straight over into the water. And the instructor comes along with his great big inflatable boat with a big engine on the back. And he's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Stop, stop, stop. He said, you've left your keel on the shore. You need to put your keel in. And we were like, no, we're fine, we're fine. He said, no, you're only fine when there's no waves at all, when there's no storm. But as soon as the waves or the storm comes, you've got nothing, and that's why you're immediately being flipped into the drink. And my point is, the church, the Philadelphia of the church, the brotherly and sisterly love for one another is like the keel on the boat. You know, the truth is that in life, everything's fine right up until the point where it isn't fine anymore. When the sun's shining and the birds are singing and the water's as still as a mill pond, then we can neglect our friendships and our matrix of relationships and our love for each other, because actually you can kind of get by without them. But when the storm comes, our love for one another is like the keel on the boat. It keeps us stable and secure and able to ride through the waves. Some years ago, I saw an interview with Nicky Gumbel. In fact, Nicky Gumbel was interviewing the leader of a big Pentecostal denomination. And this other leader was speaking about the season of his life during which his wife was diagnosed with inoperable cancer, and then she subsequently died. And it was a really moving interview, and Nicky Gumbel, one of the questions he asked, he said, can you tell me, what do you think you learned during that season? And this guy immediately came back and he said, I learned that it's much better to build a storm shelter before the storm comes than it is to try to put a storm shelter together when the storm is already here. And my point is, of course, just like the keel, you know, the brotherly love, the relationships, the friendships we have with each other are the things that form a shelter in difficult times. You know, people often ask, is it possible to be a Christian and to not be part of a local church? And my response to that is often, well, it's theoretically possible, but why would anyone ever want to try it? We need one another. You know, we're in a society right now which is incredibly isolating. You know, everything seems to be set up to draw us away from each other. And all of the surveys say that nearly all of us have fewer friends than we would have done even 10 years ago. Let's buck the trend. Let's make sure that we are friends with one another. Church is supposed to be a place not of, you know, a crowd of strangers. It's supposed to be a community of friends. Again, as pastors, we get to see a bird's eye view, and I'm so grateful we do, because we see all kinds of acts of friendship and love for one another in just a remarkable and beautiful way. You know, we see the things that are almost invisible, the phone calls, the text messages, the WhatsApps, all of these kinds of things just hidden from view. We see the envelopes with £10 notes stuffed in them. We hear about them being stuffed through people's doors when they're having a rough time. We hear the stories about how, you know, the Asda man knocks at the door of a family that's struggling, and it's like, oh, I've got this huge shop for you. And they're like, I don't understand, I didn't order anything. And they say, no, somebody's ordered it for you. Nobody knows where it came from, but there are people in this church who know exactly where it came from because it was you. We've heard stories of connect groups clubbing together to buy a young family a car. We've had other stories similar about people clubbing together to buy people funerals. This is a remarkable church, and I just want to affirm that and say it's a privilege to be part of it. I'm so grateful for all the different acts of kindness and love that go on. And again, I would say, as Paul said, do so more and more. Do so more and more. Okay, so what is Paul doing? He's commending them. What is he commending them for? He's commending them for their incredible love for each other and for the wider church. And lastly, what is it that Paul's teaching? Verse 11, make it your ambition, he says, to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you won't depend on anybody. A number of years ago, we had a staff team day, and we went to those, what do you call it, kind of like a breakout room, an escape room. You'll probably have seen it. It's just underneath the railway arches on the back end of Union Square. And we went there as teams, and in my team, it's like a team of 6 or 8 people. We took it incredibly seriously, being locked in this room, this railway arch, with all these different clues, and we could just, you know, we were just considering every clue. There were lots of moments of silence, everyone thinking really hard, but we could hear in the next door railway arch the total opposite of that. There were a whole bunch of extroverts and loud people in that group, and it was just getting louder and louder, and they were just you know, coming up with different ideas and stuff like that. I could hear one of our site pastors, who shall remain nameless, but let's just say they're a very big personality, very extroverted, and really people person, and they were especially loud. And then somebody else in the group who maybe wasn't so much, they said, hey, would you mind please using your indoor voice? Is that what Paul's saying here? Live a quiet life. Like, could you just turn the volume down? You're too loud. I don't think that it is. The word that's translated there as quiet in verse 11 appears 4 other times in the New Testament. One of them is more like resting. So on Easter Saturday, the women who were preparing the herbs and spices to place on Jesus' body, it says that they rested, they were quiet on the Saturday. So that's one use. But the other 3 are all moments in the scriptures where a big argument could have taken place, and somebody chooses quietness. They choose to remain silent. So for example, in Acts 21, when the Apostle Paul is saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and everyone's saying, don't go to Jerusalem. And then finally, it just says they held their peace. They kept their peace. They chose silence. They decided to not argue. So really, this word quiet is kind of used where the opposite word would be like argumentative or obstructive or angry. Live a quiet life. Is Paul asking people to turn the volume down? I really don't think so. He's urging them to live a quieting life, or a peaceable life, or a generous and gentle life, or a kind life, a gracious life. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life rather than a provocative and angry life. A while ago, a friend was telling me that sociologists are describing the world that we live in, and they're using an acronym which is VUCA, V-U-C-A. It stands for volatile, ambiguous, complex, and angry. seems like a really good way to describe our world. If you go on social media, you'll see it straight away, this kind of anger just seething out of everything. In fact, just recently I was hearing that the owner of Facebook and the owner of Twitter they've challenged each other to physically cage fight each other. You know, Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And that is in a way the very example of the personification of the anger, the seething anger of the world that we live in. So Paul is calling us, he's challenging us in a world that shouts to live quietly, in a world that disagrees, in a world that hates, in a world that provokes, in a world that disputes, to be ministers and agents of quiet and peace. Paul says elsewhere in Romans 14:19, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. The writer to the Hebrews says it like this, Hebrews 12 verse 14, make every effort to live at peace with everyone. That's the call of God on the Christian community. Not to be angry, not to cause arguments, but to try to diffuse the bomb. And so as followers of the way, we live the way of Jesus. We make peace. We forgive over and over and over again. We serve one another with a ministry of reconciliation and kindness. How do we stay healthy and fruitful as a church? How do we make sure that we don't become dry and stale and hard or even bad? I think we commend and encourage each other as often as possible. We call out the good in one another. We profoundly and deeply love each other. And we make it our ambition to live quietly and peaceably with everyone. Amen.